Welcome to Clear Mountain Interview Conversation. Today we're blessed and very thankful, very grateful to have Lumpur Khemadhammo with us. Lumpur, thank you very much for joining us.
My pleasure.
So I'll just read a quick biography of Lumpur. So Lumpur Khemadhammo, or Jalkun Pawanawite, OBE, was born in England in 1944. After training and practicing as a professional actor and working at the Royal National Theatre with Laurence Olivier, among others, in 1971 he traveled to Thailand via the Buddhist holy sites in India. In 1971, in Bangkok, he became a novice, and about a month later moved to Ubon to stay at Wat Nong Pa Pong with Ajahn Chah, with whom he received bhikkhu ordination. In 2003, he was appointed an officer of the Most Excellent Order of the British Empire, an OBE, for services to prisoners and for his creation of the Angulimala Buddhist Prison Chaplaincy Program. The following year, at His Majesty the King of Thailand's birthday, he was made a Jalkun with the title Prat Jalkun Pawanawite. He's the founder and abbot of the Forest Hermitage and one of the most senior Western disciples of Lumpur Cha. So, quite the bio.
And the first time I got to hear Lumpur's teachings was when I was at Ajahn Chah's memorial, and I was just immediately moved. And so it's been a real, it was wonderful that we finally got to have Lumpur on for a conversation. And Lumpur, to introduce you to the audience, or to have you introduce yourself a bit more, would you speak about maybe the key moments of faith that brought you to robes?
Well, I suppose we have to begin with my discovering Buddhism. And I was about 22 at the time, and I'd just begun working at the National Theatre. And you may not realize this, but actors do a lot of hanging about, waiting for the scenes that they're in to be rehearsed or shot or whatever. And so during that time, I couldn't play cards. My chess wasn't very good, and I used to read. And so I started reading a bit, and then, of course, meditation was becoming fashionable. This was in the 1960s in England, in London. And so I thought I'd better check it out. So I went along to the local Buddhist temple in Hampstead, near where I lived. And I started practicing meditation there. I didn't want to be a Buddhist. I was fed up with religion, didn't want to have any more to do with it. But I became hooked on meditation, and eventually, of course, began reading about Buddhism. And slowly I got to the point where I could acknowledge I was a Buddhist. And then, and this was a critical moment really for me, during the annual holiday, in those days, the National Theatre was a proper company, and we were on fairly long-term contracts, so that we had 3 weeks holiday every year. And I went for one of my holidays to a retreat place in the sort of north of England, near Stafford. And it was a pretty miserable place. It was cold and it was damp, and I was plotting my escape within about 12 hours of arriving there. But oh yes, I worked it all out. I could be in a taxi down to the station, back to London, in a travel agent's, and on a beach in Italy in no time. But anyway, I didn't follow it through, and I stayed. And it was a pretty grueling 2 weeks. But at the end of it, I felt there was nothing else worth doing with my life than pursuing the practice of Buddhism and even becoming a Buddhist monk, which in those days was not so easy for anyone in England, that is. So I wasn't quite sure what to do about that. In any case, I had a contract which I had to fulfill, and so I kind of took my time. But then, about a year later, I left the National Theatre. They did offer to renew my contract, but I decided to leave. And I bought a a small cottage in Essex, and I thought it could be a kind of part-time actor and part-time monk, but it didn't work out too well, really, and I didn't like it there. And eventually, I decided I ought to go east and have a proper look and see what happened. And so that's what I did. I set off overland, and I spent time in India, going around the holy places all by myself, and then I flew to Bangkok, and that's where, in Wat Maha Tat, I became a novice on Boxing Day, and then a little while later, thanks to advice from a friend, an old friend who I had known at the Thai temple in London, who was already a monk. He'd travelled out ahead of me, and he was with Wat Pah Pong. And he said to me, I happened to meet him on a street in Bangkok, and he said to me, he said, if you want to be a real monk, there's only one place to go, Wat Pah Pong. So what can you do after that? I went to Wat Pah Pong. And that's where my life really as a monk properly began. Yeah.
Lumpur, we'll definitely go much deeper into your relationship with Lumpur Cha and what you learned from him. And I am curious just to linger a little bit on your training, formal training as an actor. And I'm curious if there are any specific skills that you were developing as an actor, which did transfer to being skills in meditation, or if it was the opposite. I mean, on one level, it seems like you're cultivating the capacity to embody a self as an actor, perhaps, whereas in meditation, you're trying to drop that. Or how would you frame that whole shift in your life?
Well, I haven't really seen it as a shift. I've seen it as an extension. And you see, and I do look back on my training as an actor. That was terribly important to me, and has been important throughout my life. That whole process of training as an actor, yes, you're taught to investigate the minds of people, and you're taught. I was taught, really, a practice of meditation. And of course, I used to do a practice of meditation at times, sitting in front of my mirror, making up and so forth, and going over in my mind what my character was about and what he was trying to do. And that was one of the things we were taught to investigate. What is he or she trying to do? You know, and it rhymes very well with Buddhist teaching, I discovered. So I've not felt really. I mean, people think about the glamour of being an actor, and there's bits of that in the life of an actor. That's what people outside see, but it's far from the whole story. It's very hard work being an actor, and being a reasonably successful one. And I was reasonably successful, and I worked a lot, and I worked very hard. People don't see that, nor do they see the kind of introspection that it requires. And that, of course, connects with Buddhism and Buddhist practice. And I would say that there is a spirituality to theatre and to being an actor. I wouldn't have said that at the time, but with hindsight, yes. And I think I was involved in that. I wasn't doing it for the money. I feel in a way it's kind of matured beyond what I was doing then, I suppose. And the whole training of an actor and the discipline of an actor has been invaluable as a monk. It has made me, I realize, and some people don't like me for this, that I can be exacting and a bit severe. But then I learnt from the actors I worked with, particularly Laurence Olivier. People nowadays, of course, don't remember him very well, but he was arguably the greatest actor in the world and one of the greatest there has ever been. But he was a stickler for perfection and, well, I suppose in a way quite very particular. You know, I mean, his makeup for Othello, I can't remember how many hours it took him. But he went to great lengths with his makeups. So he'd be sitting there for a couple of hours, 2 or 3 hours. And I think almost every hair of his beard was put on individually. Yeah.
Lumpur, it's interesting. I know in ancient Greece, they often put the theater next to the hospital. So this idea of healing the body and healing the psyche seemed quite appropriate. And I hadn't expected the conversation to go this way. But I want to ask more about that act of embodying a self. But before that, I really can't move on without asking about your opinion about the Dharma of Shakespeare. You know, I've heard someone say that all Western literature exists in the shadow of Shakespeare, and, you know, a towering intellect like that. What kind of gems of wisdom or Dharma have you seen in Shakespeare? How do you think about that writer?
Oh, well, with great admiration.
And are there any of the plays or writings of Shakespeare? You know, do any of them have there been any gems of kind of wisdom or Dharma that have shown through to you from those works since you were
Yes, well,
much?
yes. I mean, well, the most memorable speech called "The 7 Ages of Man," all the world's a stage, and all the men and women on it merely players. Yeah.
Lumpur, I'd be curious to move from the genius of Shakespeare to the genius of Lumpur Cha. Listening to a talk that you gave a while back, you made a very succinct statement that undoubtedly Lumpur Cha was a genius. And you've also said that you're never sure if you met a more loving and compassionate person, and that he might be the nearest thing to pure love that you've ever experienced, maybe one interaction in particular. And I'm curious if you could speak to both of those qualities, the quality of genius and the quality of love of Lumpur Cha, as you experienced both of those.
Well, if I start with the love, I mean, he didn't talk much about love, about loving kindness. He did, but you know, it's not something I remember him saying about. But he embodied it unquestionably, and he had a quality of honesty. And I think this is very important. I've been thinking quite a lot about it lately, and speaking about it too, about generosity. I think it's terribly important. I saw it too in some successful actors, but I saw it in him. And there was certainly one occasion early on when I didn't realize he was behind me, standing behind me somewhere, and he called my name. And as I turned, it was like I was sort of dazzled by this, by his presence. Difficult to explain. And it happened again once, some time later. But of course, you know, he had a great deal of, despite the fact that he could be very demanding and very strict, and he wasn't an easy person to live with on occasions, I can tell you. But he certainly had a go at me more than once. But you know, in a way, I didn't mind that. I was used to that. This was part of the benefit of being an actor. And we were taught very early on, you're going to be criticized, get used to it. And it's true. And so as a monk, I wasn't too bothered. I took notice of what he said, but I wasn't upset or offended by it. And I think I almost expected it. But as a genius, he wasn't an unremarkable man when you first met him. That was my experience. I wasn't sort of bowled over by him when I first met him, not at all. And when I first went to Ubon and went to Wat Pah Pong, I was a bit turned off by the sort of extreme kind of faith people had in him, including one or two of the Western, well, American monks who were present. I didn't really quite like that, and I couldn't easily accept it. But as time passed, he really grew on me, and that's, I think, when I began to see the genius of the person. Because when you teach the Dharma, well, you can only repeat what so many people have said already, but you can repeat it, you can say it in ways that make it live. He was an entertainer and teacher. I suppose he had a kind of magnetism. Certainly, there were a lot of monks drawn to him and wanting to live with him and train with him. And his approach was to use, this was something that was unusual at the time, to use the Vinaya, to use the discipline, make it a tool with which you could fashion and develop yourself. And that was unusual. And he also, of course, developed a core practice of the temple, which was also important. And everyone fell in with that.
Longpor, it's rare we get these glimpses into Longpor Cha, and I wondered if you would be able to speak a bit more about one or two specific stories that really did kind of have stayed with you since your time with him, either of faith or of him, as you said, kind of admonishing you in a way that kind of stuck around, or anything really, just a glimpse into Longpor Cha, a few specific anecdotes.
Well, I was very fortunate that I spent quite a long time with him. I don't think many people appreciate that I did have that contact with him. I spent one pansa at Wat Pah Pong, my fourth pansa, and I would often go Pindapat with him during that time. And then later, of course, I was fortunate because I came with him and Ajahn Chah to England, and I spent quite a lot of time with him then, and I had to look after him and do things for him. And I took him, I invited him to visit the family home, my parents, and that's where I grew up. And so I had to take him on the train down to Portsmouth and then across the ferry to Gosport, where my father picked us up. And he stayed a couple of nights, I think it was. And during that time, first of all, we can show him around a bit, And so we took him out on a drive, and the plan had been to take him to Winchester Cathedral, but it poured with rain. It just teemed with rain when we got to Winchester, and there was no chance of getting out of that car and getting anywhere near the cathedral without being drenched. So we gave up on that, and we turned back And then on the drive back, my mother insisted that we call at a distant cousin of mine, someone I hardly knew really and truly. And so we called in there. And of course, it was time for afternoon tea. And it was a very English setting. So in we went, and the tea came out, and all the family there, and my parents and so on sat around the tea table up one end of the room, quite a long room, and the cups of tea and the seedy cake and all the rest of it. And down the other end of the room, on a sofa, sat Luang Por Chah and me. And after a while, he nudged me in the ribs and said to me, in Thai, of course, he said to me, "Ask them if they suffer." My immediate reaction was, this is neither the time nor the place, but about to just get out of it. And the room went quiet. And they'd noticed that he'd said something. And they were all sort of poised, teacups halfway to the mouth. And I was trapped. And I had to say to him, he wants to know if you suffer. Imagine the anyway, I had to say to him, they don't understand. And then on that same trip, so there it was, Sunday evening, he'd been in churches and cathedrals and whatnot, but this was used to leading. So he's marching ahead, right up the aisle. And there's all these people, I didn't know what they thought was happening. Anyway, then eventually chose a pew, fairly sort of under the pulpit, and we filed in, and that's where we sat through the service. And there was a kind of stand-in clergyman that evening who was desperately nervous, and made more so because when he got up to give his sermon, Luang Por Chah produced his tape recorder. He had a small Sony tape recorder which he was devoted to. So you see pictures occasionally of him. It looks like he's got a priest with a prayer book, but it's actually one of those little dictaphone type things. So plonk sat down. And this poor man, I mean, he was a nervous wreck up in the pulpit trying to give his sermon. And it wasn't very good at all. Ajahn Chah, of course, didn't understand a word of it, but he realized it wasn't very good. And later on, he said, back at Hampstead, he said, even Khemadhammo could have done better.
Wow, Luang Por. I'd never heard that story.
Not all the people know that.
That's fascinating. One story that I have heard seems quite consequential. You were riding with Luang Por Chah on a train to somewhere, and you asked him a question and got basically the advice that became the genesis of the Angulimala prison project. Could you talk about that occurrence and what is the Angulimala prison project?
Well, that was the occasion when I took him down. We were on the train to Portsmouth, and the Hampstead Buddhist Vihara was the address that the prison service had for matters and inquiries about Buddhism. And I knew that. I knew that before I went to Thailand, because I knew Kapilawado, who founded the English Sangha Trust. And in fact, I went to see him just before I left England. He died the same year. So I saw him in something like August, and he died, I don't know, I can't remember now, but in November or December. But he told me that he used to get inquiries from the prisons. And of course, when we arrived in Hampstead in 1977, then inquiries came in from the prisons. We had a letter from the chaplain at Parkhurst on the Isle of Wight, another one from the chaplain at Pentonville in London, and a phone call from the chaplain at the women's prison Holloway, not very far away, in London. So that was starting. There was an interest. And clearly, if anyone was going to respond, it was going to have to be me. And I was quite interested. I didn't think there were many prisons in England. So I had no idea really quite what I was getting myself into. I thought that I might have something to offer. So I was interested. So then on that journey, I thought I'd better ask Ajahn Chah what he thought about it. So eventually, I rather sort of gingerly put the question to him about, should I go into these prisons? Should I accept these invitations? And so far as I remember, he was pretty direct, and Thai can be very direct, and so it was, bye, go. So that was it, really, and so that's what I've been doing ever since. So it's nearly 50 years now. I'm still doing it. And as I say, to begin with, I thought there were only 2 or 3 prisons. I'd heard of some, particularly the famous ones in England, Parkhurst, Pentonville, Holloway, those 3, in fact, very well known. I knew about them. I didn't know where they were, but I knew they existed. Anyway, I started going. So I went to the Isle of Wight, to Parkhurst, and when I got there, I discovered there were 2 more prisons on the island, and all 3 were expecting me. And I went to Pentonville, I went to Holloway. And what I discovered, and this was particularly the case from the 3 on the island, was prisoners get moved to other prisons. And so that was started to happen. I was seeing on the Isle of Wight, in the prisons there, got moved. And then they rather expected me to come and see them in their new. I gradually began to collect prisons all over the place, mostly in the south of England. And after a while, of course, after a few years of this, it was getting out of hand. And I was getting a bit done in by it all. Because the journeys were not easy. I didn't have someone to drive me. People would organize a railway ticket for me. But then when I got off the train, I'd have a mile or 2 to walk. And so that was what led us to think about organizing things properly. And what was happening, what we discovered was happening, was that a person would have an interest in Buddhism. There'd be no Buddhist chaplain or no Buddhist visitor. So we thought this was just no good. We needed to have someone appointed to each prison, even if there were no Buddhists in the prison. So there was someone ready to go in when a Buddhist appeared. So that's what we decided to do. And we went and had a meeting with the sort of hierarchy of the prison chaplaincy. And they were a bit suspicious of us, but they sort of warmed us when they realized it wasn't going to cost them anything. Anyway, so we set up Angulimala, and a story which gives hope to many people incarcerated.
Thank you so much, Longpor. And the story of Angulimala is likely one many of our listeners do know. But for those who don't, the story of a kind of mass murder in the time of the Buddha who converted ordained and became an enlightened being. And one of the things most profound, I think, about that story is how the kind of transmutation of Angulimala, um, and how much spiritual kind of power he had hidden in him, ready to emerge very quickly when the Buddha opened that door. And I know one thing you've spoken about in terms of those who are incarcerated is how, in many ways, their lives are quite similar to those in the monastery, and that you saw this immediate parallel. Um, but I'm curious, there's so many things you could have done with your extra or additional time in England and as a monastic. What, in particular, led you to feel this work in the prisons was worth continuing, and giving so much time to? Was there something you saw in the kind of transformation of these incarcerated people which felt particularly meaningful or precious, such that you felt, inspired to give so much of your life to it?
Well, for start, people in prison are people, and they're an extraordinary cross section of people. But you have to remember, you see, that no one is just a criminal or just a prisoner or just a murderer or just a burglar. And for all the terrible things that some people have done, they all have qualities. And I've witnessed and benefited sometimes too from their generosity and kindness and sheer humanity. So I've been touched by that. And you have to also to realize that their world, the world of prisons, is one that is terribly neglected. People don't want to know about people in prison. They're written off by many people, by the population at large. And that's unfair, I think. So I've always felt a tremendous sympathy with people in prison. Years ago, one particular person, being who had been in prison a very long time, paid me an extraordinary compliment. And he said of me on one occasion, he said, "You love us." I'm an Englishman. And I don't think about, I'm not a sentimentalist, and people sometimes think I'm a bit hard, but it really touched me, that, and I thought to myself, well, I think I didn't say that to him, but I thought about it afterwards, and yes, I suppose that's true. And perhaps also, I've thought about this too, that, as an actor, you're a bit of a dropout. As a Buddhist monk, you're a bit of a dropout. And as a prisoner, you're very much a dropout. So perhaps, I could connect with that.
Lumpur, here in America, there are a number of different almost certainly inspired by Angulimala project. That was probably one of the first, if not the first, Buddhist prison project outside of a Buddhist country. But one of the programs here in America has a principle of GRIP, the acronym GRIP, guiding rage into power. And I'm curious if you could speak to that. A lot of people do go to jail because this quality of rage, this quality of anger has just expressed itself. And it is one of the tragedies of anger and rage that, in an instant, you can just destroy a life, your own life, the life of another person. And I'm curious if you could speak to that, any real shifts or the capacity that you've seen to transmute this quality of dosa or of anger into something useful.
I've not been. I was rather shocked by what you've just said, because I don't. Of course, people in prison do get angry and frustrated, but I'm not sure that that's what's brought them to prison. I don't have that sense, really. I mean, of course, there will be exceptions, and certainly one man I can think of increased his criminal activity because he was getting angry at how he was treated. Not in prison, but outside. Wouldn't immediately say, oh, anger and rage. I certainly wouldn't use the term rage is behind the criminal activity and that's caused the people I see to be in prison. There are many tragedies, of course. But I wouldn't. I'm surprised by that.
Okay. Well, thank you for that clarification. Yeah.
And one thing I'm curious about is which teachings of the Buddha you found to be most relevant and most transformative to the inmates who you're kind of working with.
I think really the fact that people can change, but also that there is more to any of us than sometimes meets the eye, and certainly more to people who've ended up in prison than just being criminals or prisoners, and for that to be acknowledged and to be developed, that potential, the potential is there to do more and to do better, and even ultimately to be an enlightened being. And that's tremendously helpful, really. Otherwise it's so easy to just be condemned as such and such, when in fact there's a lot more there.
And Lumpur, which teachings have you seen particularly useful in terms of bringing out that potential in transforming people? What kind of practical means does the program you've brought to the prisons entail?
Well, we simply teach the Buddha Dhamma, so and from the very basics, the Four Noble Truths and so on. But certainly the practice of cultivating the Brahma Viharas, we've realized, is very important. I mean, it's important to anyone, I think, but particularly to people in prison, because the whole business of being restricted and being unable to go home and being unable to do various things can be frustrating and make people angry. And of course, living in close proximity, you can't, if you fall out with someone, you can't go to another room, or you can't do things that normal people can do. So that practice we found to be very important. And for people to, and this I think is important for anyone actually, to learn to love themselves, or at least appreciate themselves. I think nowadays, for a lot of people don't really love themselves, don't really appreciate themselves. And I think that's terribly important. And you see, it's led me to, I mean, I've contemplated the Brahma Viharas for years, of course, but the third, as it's translated, always has struck me as being very kind of clumsy, you know, sympathetic joy or empathetic joy. A bit of a mouthful, and nowadays I prefer to think of it in terms as appreciating the good qualities in someone, and appreciating even the good qualities in yourself, because they get overlooked, you know. And it's the negative traits that people tend to focus on. And you know, we easily criticize other people. It's much more difficult to really look at someone, even someone you don't like very much, and say, well, he may be, you know, a bit nasty sometimes, but he's very generous.
Well, I really appreciate that, seeing mudita as appreciation. I also appreciate the softness, the root of mudita being mood, or to soften. And I'm curious, in terms of appreciation, some of the statistics I looked at of the Angulimala project are almost certainly dated, but at one point you had 1,600 inmate students and had trained 50 or more kind of Buddhist chaplains. But specifically on this, in the Buddhist chaplain training program that you kind of created or oversee, one of the suggestions was that Buddhist chaplains be familiar with other Buddhist schools. So have an appreciation of other Buddhist schools and be able to kind of minister to someone who is maybe Tibetan Buddhist or Chinese Buddhist or something else. And I found that really interesting and big-hearted. And I've always, in my mind, because you're one of the most senior students of Luang Por Chah, have really held you in my mind as like this bastion of pure Theravada in my mind. and I'm curious if you could speak to that. Either is this just a skillful means with the parishioners, or do you yourself have an appreciation of these other schools, or how do you suggest that any individual, whether prisoner, inmate, or just lay person or monk, relate to these other Buddhist schools and possibly taking their skillful means on?
Well, for a start, it's been a necessity for Buddhist chaplains because, as we know, there are many schools of Buddhism, and while for the most part, Buddhist or prisoners who register as Buddhist don't have strong affiliations with any one school. Every so often, we do get someone who is, a dyed-in-the-wool Theravadan or Tibetan of one school or another, or a Zen person or whatever, and we have to be able to relate to them and even to encourage them in their path. So we set out in the beginning to say that we would offer what I will prefer to call essential Buddhism, the essence, which means really the Four Noble Truths, Noble Eightfold Path, some teachings on karma and rebirth, and so on, but to not go into the controversies. Now, when I first got into Buddhism in this country, one of the things that was rather off-putting was that if you went to different places, they would tend to speak ill of other places. And that has been a feature of Western Buddhism. And I don't like that very much. So I would prefer to bring people together than to divide people. And I think really it's very important within the Buddhist world that we try and do that. That doesn't mean that we've all got to agree. You know, I have friends who I can disagree with. But I would rather promote good relations and friendship. And yes, and recently we've set up a course for the Buddhist chaplains because I've been concerned for a long time. It's been my responsibility now for many years to endorse the Buddhist prison chaplains, to say that a certain person is suitable to Buddhist prison chaplain. Concern for me always has been about really how much they know and so forth. We have no qualification. So I wanted to bring about a qualification for our Buddhist prison chaplains. And a few years ago, the Buddhist university, one of the Buddhist universities in Thailand, published a book called Common Buddhist Texts. And it's very good. When I first heard about it, I wondered if it would be, much useful. But yeah, I had my doubts. But when I saw it, I was very impressed. And it's taking the basic themes of Buddhism, which occur in all the schools, and giving quotations from texts on those, say, what does the Mahayana have to say about karma? What does the Theravada say? And it's very, very interesting. Mm-hmm. And it has the effect of bringing the schools together. It's not saying they're all the same or that we agree, but it's not pointing up the differences. It's pointing up what we have in common. And it's marvelous because it enriches your understanding of things, because it expands your consideration of what karma might mean, for example. And so we've based a course for the Buddhist prison chaplains on that book, and we've just started it now. It's we've got a few people doing it, and it's being very successful. And the way we run it is that we use the book, but each student has a mentor, and the mentor is an experienced Buddhist prison chaplain. So it's also learning to use the teachings, use what we find in the book with the prisoners. How would you use this? It's because we're dealing with a very specialized world, really. It's not the same as out there. These are people of a different, not exactly different, but they are in a particular situation. And it's going quite well. Of course, we're learning as we go along, but I'm really very pleased with it. Yeah.
Lumpur, just as there's meaning in finding these common elements between the schools, I find a lot of meaning in hearing about the particularities of the individuals involved and the stories of, I'm the story guy between us. And so I know you can't go into names or too many specifics at all, but I did wonder if you could just ground these programs and this history in maybe one or two anecdotes or stories of some person you've worked with who's really been changed over these years by the work in the prisons.
The changes are changes that they make themselves, and they make themselves influenced by what they're learning and hearing about Buddhist practice. And people don't quite realize this, I think, but an awful lot of people, having messed up their lives, are desperate to put things right and to have a good place in society. So when they take up the Buddha Dhamma, it's a means, they realize, of purifying themselves, of leaving behind what they've done, and so forth. Yes, I have one or two stories, but I daren't tell them, I think.
I understand, Lopor.
Lepore, I'm curious. We've mentioned some of these kind of accolades that you've gotten. You were given by the Queen of England the title of OBE, given by the King of Thailand the title of Jalkun Pawanawite, by the President of Mahachula, one of the great universities of Thailand, an honorary doctorate, given by the President of Burma the title of Uga Mahasadama Jyotika Daja. Very long titles. And we've got these teachings in the Samyutta Nikaya, a whole chapter on gain, honor, and praise, dreadful or gain, honor, and praise, like a horsehair rope, or like a barbed dagger, or like a lightning bolt, like a dung for a dung beetle. And I'm curious just how you hold that. You've been a monk for a long time. So yeah, how have you held that? Is it been strange getting all these worldly accolades, given that you became a monk? All of us become monks to kind of give that up, in a sense. I'm just curious for advice.
Well, the OBE was one thing about all of them is that I've really enjoyed the ceremonies. But apart from that, of course, well, they have some meaning for particular groups of people, I suppose you would say. And the OBE had tremendous meaning for the prisoners. It really did. And I was so pleased by the fact that it was given for services to prisoners. I was very pleased with that. And it has given me a bit more, I suppose, respectability, and that, I think, has been useful in what I've done with the prisons, and being able to speak about stuff in prison. It's yeah. So that's been useful. The others have been, various groups of people have been impressed or not. I don't know, but
memorize the whole length of the Burmese title.
Yeah, it's impressive. I mean, I would translate it, but it would take a while. So yeah.
Longpor,
it was a wonderful ceremony.
It's interesting. We have we were writing out the different questions we had for you, and they're just all these little facets of different parts of your life, which I think are really worth asking about. And one we haven't touched on is kind of monasticism in itself. And I remember the first talk I heard you giving, I think you said, they said I wouldn't make it, but here I am. And, and something like that. It was a certain kind of appreciation for the fact that you've managed to stay in robes for so many years. And I'm curious, what have you seen as the key element keeping someone in robes as a monastic? What have you seen as kind of the quintessential ingredient?
Well, I mean, for me, it's the best thing to be doing, um, and and I can't really, I suppose. I'm not quite sure how to put all this really. As we all know, it can be quite a difficult life at times, and certainly it's been so for me. It hasn't been easy, but you can't go back in life. I don't want to go back. You've got to go forward, and this for me is the best thing to be doing. It's the highest and the best thing to be doing. I may not be doing it as well as I'd like to, and sort of certainly looking back, now I'm getting oldish. I can sometimes wish I'd done a better job of it. Yeah, I can say that. I wish I'd made a better job of it. But yes, I mean, I think you have to hold it as the supreme kind of ideal. I don't know if that's expressing it quite accurately, but it's there. That's what I hold. So there's no going. You can't go back. Only go forward.
Lumpur, I have listened to the entirety of every talk that is on your YouTube channel. And that might sound like a feat. It seems like and it was enjoyable. But that actually wasn't that hard to do, because you don't have that many talks on your YouTube channel. And what that points to, I think, is just the development of technology. You've been a monk for almost 55 years. And in that time, the technology of the world of communication has just changed remarkably, astonishingly. You talked about Lumpur Cha's tape cassette player, but he had a tape cassette player, was listening, and even people would record him. He himself giving that Ban Thi Te Ching, the Our Real Home. He recorded himself doing that. And I'm curious if your mind, so your YouTube channel, at least this one, the current one, just started, less than a year ago. And I'm curious if your mind has changed about, different monks have different perceptions about the allowance or the appropriateness of monks having a YouTube channel or being on Facebook or being on Instagram or whatever. And I love monasteries that have strict policies for junior monks. I certainly benefited from that at Abhayagiri. But as a senior monk, just curious of your thoughts, either about how media has changed or about how you choose to interact with media now and sharing your voice and your wisdom with the world. I've certainly very much benefited from it. So,
thank you. I've never been that comfortable about recording things and recording myself. And I haven't had, for the most part, as well, even going back to the days of tape recordings and so on, I haven't had people recording me. And I haven't particularly minded that. And somehow it relates back to, I appreciated the theatre. I liked the theatre more than film or television. I did it all. I did film, television, radio. I liked radio a lot. I liked doing radio. But I liked the sort of the life of theatre. It's a living experience. It's a living moment. Other medium like film and television and so on, and I did it all when I was an actor. That's to me is kind of dead. It hasn't got the life of the moment, and I feel this way a bit about talks and stuff, and I think that's partly why I haven't bothered very much about recording things and
We're glad you made an exception today, Longpor. And in terms of sort of the alive moment for people, we've kept you for quite a long time, but I did have this final question. One of the most, I think, sort of raw or direct experiences people can have just in their weekly lives is encountering people in the city or on the street who really are struggling, and who I think probably, as you mentioned with some of the inmates you've worked with, really only seeing the darkness in themselves, or really conceiving themselves as cast off or dropped out of the bottom of society. And I know people often don't know how to interact with people like that in a way that makes them feel seen, makes them feel honored, and kind of preserves their dignity. So would you have any kind of thoughts to offer listeners about when they encounter people who are down and out or homeless, or I know there's, that's not the case with people in prison necessarily, but just in those difficult spots where they feel looked down on, how do you recommend people kind of approach those individuals that they feel cared for?
be kind. Be kind, and I think really also to treat them just as you would treat anyone else.
Lumpur, thank you so much for spending time with us. Would recommend that people listen to every talk that you've given on your YouTube channel. People can also sign up. I think you've got a weekly newsletter, or which I think is prisoners can read. But it's also got updates. You've got a very sweet and loving relationship with at least 3 tortoises, Speedy, Henry, and Gilbert, maybe more. But I really appreciate your teachings and your example, honestly, having monastics who've come before us and kind of trailblazed. You are this first generation of Western disciples in the Thai forest tradition, and we look up to you and are just so appreciative of your time.
And Lumpur, thank you for seeing the unseen, those who aren't kind of acknowledged as much by society, and caring for them.
Thank you.